I know you're worried about how I'm going to get off the stage, and so I'll let you know a little secret. I'm worried about it too, actually. This one's going to help me out. It's a delight to be able to introduce George Gilder, and I won't spend a lot of time on his bio because you have a copy of it in your program. Just a few things about him. He is a co-founder and the founding fellow of the Discovery Institute with Bruce Chapman, headquartered in Seattle, where I've been a long-time fellow and affiliate. He's the author of over 20 books, including just a few of his very important ones. Wealth and Poverty, written in the early 1980s, was a seminal book in supply-side economics. It made George the most widely quoted living author in Ronald Reagan's speeches. He went on to write another book related to it called The Spirit of Enterprise, and then started turning his attention to technology, writing a number of seminal books from Microcosm and Telecosm, The Silicon Eye, and then in 2013, a very important book that I recommend to all of you called Knowledge and Power, in which George integrates these two kind of intellectual trajectories of his own work, that is his interest in market economies and his interest in information theory, and has proposed in Knowledge and Power what he calls a new information theory of economics. His most recent book, actually out this last year, is called Life After Google, a profoundly important book, and I think, may not have this exactly right, but George spent a lot of the last year actually in China. This is a wildly popular book in China. I think maybe the number 2 most popular new book in China last year. There are a lot of people in China, so this is quite significant. The publisher, I think, is very pleased to have gotten a deal with that Chinese publication right off the bat. But George is a longtime friend of mine, and it is especially meaningful to me to be able to introduce him because I understand my own work as essentially an attempt to extend the work of Michael Novak and to translate the work of George Gilder. But I would say probably more than any two thinkers on economics in the 20th century, Michael Novak and George Gilder have most plumbed the depths of the theological insight that the human person made in the image of the creative God is the source of ideas, is the source of value, is the source of wealth creation. He had some very interesting interactions in his life with Michael Novak, I hope he'll tell us about. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming George Gilder.
Thank you so much, Jay. It's really inspirational for me to be at this beautiful campus. I think it's my first visit to this absolutely exquisite campus in the middle of Washington. And I admire the architecture and the vision and the faith. And I had especially exciting to talk at Novak Symposium, because Michael Novak had a deep influence in my life. He took me all the way to the Philippines to speak there. He took me to the Vatican to attest to the virtues of Centesimus Annus, and he induced me to read all these encyclicals from Rerum Novarum through Centesimus Annus, which was the anniversary commentary on Rerum Novarum, and that encyclical really epitomized the thrust of much of my subsequent work, which led to the information theory of capitalism. And my speaking career would have been depleted without 2 great contributions from Michael, which I don't always credit him with in the course of my arm-waving discourse. But 2 key points he made that I cherish, and one is that the word capitalism derives from the Latin word caput, which means head, and renders capitalism the mind-centered system. That was a great thesis of Michael, which I much valued and much cited. And the other great statement of Michael, which I think is his a really supreme insight and trope, is that humans are made to be creative in the image of their creator. This links the creativity of capitalism with the deep Catholic faith that Michael evinced throughout his career. And those two great insights really are the heart of my elaboration of this crucial insight from Centesimus Annus in 1991. Work becomes ever more fruitful and productive to the extent that people become more knowledgeable of the productive potentialities of the earth and more profoundly cognizant of the needs of those for whom their work is done. I've had a long theme that capitalism is ultimately altruistic, and this is an exposition of the roots of that insight. Capitalists have to be responsive to the needs of others, imaginatively responsive to the needs of others, and have to collaborate with others, and have to save, which means foregoing consumption in order to serve the intra-voluntary decisions of others in the market. Capitalism is ultimately oriented toward the needs of others. This thesis of wealth and poverty did not make me popular with Ayn Rand, who I think is a genius of her kind and a great defender of capitalism if you really plunge deep into her work. But she devoted her final speech at Ford Hall Forum to refuting my socialistic adoption of altruism as a value of capitalism. Then Centesimus Annus continued. In our time, there exists a form of ownership which is becoming no less important even than land. That is the possession of know-how, technology, and skill. The wealth of industrialized nations is based much more on this source than on natural resources. And that was a great insight of Pope John Paul, and it really sums up the roots of the information theory of capitalism that I've expounded: knowledge and power, scandal of money, 21st century case for gold, and now in Life After Google. And I think since I've just been to China expounding Life After Google in 4 cities, 40 speeches, I thought I might show you the slides of Life After Google to enrich this argument. So, well, this is Life After Television was sort of the inspiration of Life After Google. And back then I declared that the computer of the future would be as portable as your watch, as personal as your wallet. It would recognize speech. It would navigate streets. It would collect your news and your mail. Just might not do windows. Do doors, open doors to your future. Anyway, that was back in the early 1990s, and Steve Jobs passed it around to people at Apple. So I like to think I had made some contribution to the arrival of the smartphone. As Michael Novak supremely understood, every technological era expresses a system of the world. It expresses the philosophical and cultural presumptions that guide the evolution of the technology. And so life after Google asserts that Google is not just technology, it expresses the system of the world. And I've been in China, and so I've been celebrating Wanfen, which in China means the fate that brings people and societies together. And I believe that despite all the conflicts and confusions that we currently face with China, that there is a deeper flow that brings us together to develop the new technologies of the era. And really, since much of our technology is actually manufactured in China today, most Apple products, for example, or Foxconn and other manufacturing plants, that chips are largely made in Taiwan at TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation is the only company in the world that currently produces 7 nanometer chips, which is 7 billionth of a meter, and it's the next challenge, and American companies have not yet reached this capability. And so Apple has its crucial new chips manufactured in Taiwan. And it's assembled in Shenzhen, which is the center of world industry today. And it's a fact that's hard to confront, but it is the Detroit of the 21st century is Shenzhen in China. Now, Google's system of the world is important because it prevails in most of the universities of America, this system of the world. It really focuses on big data. And the idea is that if you combine big data, sufficient amounts of information with cloud computing, you concentrate all the data in giant data warehouses, and you submit it to artificial intelligence, machine learning as they call it. You can answer all the questions of the universe, that ultimately you will attain a singularity where computer technology excels the human brain and mind and inseminates the universe and ultimately captures the universe. All the rest of us can stay back and retreat to beaches with a guaranteed annual income, while Sergey Brin and Larry Page fly off with Elon Musk to some distant planet in a winner-take-all universe. And this is, we can live on, we can be disposed of with a guaranteed annual income because there's nothing really left for us to do. And in recent, I've been, wrestling with this system of the world for a long time. But in the last month or so, I've got a new way of really showing the ultimate idiocy of the idea that the mind is a computer somehow. That somehow, if you make a computer smart enough, it somehow usurps the capabilities of the human mind. And the example I have a cousin, or got married to a cousin, who's been studying the brain of the nematode worm for the last 40-some years at the University of Wisconsin. It's the definitive study of the brain of the nematode worm, which is the smallest brain that really can be disassembled down to the molecular level and every neuron mapped in what's called the connectome of the nematode worm. That's all the connections among the neurons of the worm. And Ray Kurzweil actually cites this research. Ray Kurzweil is the great futurist and inventor who now is vice president and leading figure at Google. And also the author of the book, "The Singularity is Near," when machine brains will eclipse human minds. And Ray is really the leading intellectual figure in this movement, and he's a very nice, intelligent, brilliant man. He's a genius of the sort, and a friend of mine. But he cites the study of the nematode worm and its connectome, all maps all connections in the worm's brain, and then projects it into the brain of a human being. You multiply these neurons enough, and you get a brain the size of a human brain. And this somehow is represented to constitute human intelligence in some way. Anyway, Tony Stratton is married to my cousin, and he's headed this project at the University of Wisconsin. And he said when he started, he really agreed with Ray. He thought within 5 years he would understand the brain of the nematode worm. But now, 40 years later, he knows less than he started, although he has succeeded in mapping the connectome of the nematode worm. Well, recently I discovered that the connectome of the human brain requires a zettabyte of information to map, roughly a zettabyte. Now, I'm familiar with zettabytes. For years, I've been estimating the total information on the internet, and it mounted from terabytes to petabytes to exabytes, and finally to zettabytes, yottabytes and zettabytes. 10 to the 21st are zettabytes. And today, for the first time, all the information on the internet amounts to about a zettabyte. To map the connectome, all the connections of the human brain between all the neurons and the axons and dendrites and spindle cells across the human brain takes a zettabyte of information. In other words, the human brain has the degree of informational complexity, roughly, of all the entire global internet. One human brain. Now, but that's not, so this is sort of amazing. The internet spans the globe, while the human mind is this amazing, complex, dense element in our heads, and beyond But the real challenge is the information and energy efficiency of the human mind. We run our zettabyte on 12 to 14 watts of energy, not even enough to light up a light bulb in a cartoon model of human thinking. The internet, of course, runs on gigawatts and terawatts of energy. In other words, these two phenomena are totally unrelated. It's not anywhere near the same thing. I mean, we're billions and billions of times more efficient in processing power, if you want to term it in these mechanistic ways, as the internet. So anyway, that's the Google system of the world is really refuted by the essential science of the day. The essential neuroscience of the day clearly refutes the singularity idea. Now, going to China, if AI and the singularity is not the appropriate model of the future of the world economy and world technology. In China, Zhou Chong, who was the great Chinese monetary statesman for the last 35 years or so, he just retired last year. And he in 2009 made a major speech to the International Monetary Fund calling for the abandonment of floating currencies that dominate our world economy today. I mean, anybody who ask anybody what's the biggest industry in the world economy, they presumably say food or energy or in technology or whatever. But the biggest energy industry in the world economy by far is currency trading. $5.1 trillion a day of currency trading. That's almost 25 times more than all world GDP. It's some 75 times closely more than all world trade in goods and services. And yet, all this trading doesn't arrive at currency values sufficiently stable to prevent there emerging a huge industry of hedging these currency values. So every business that has to actually transact across borders has to hedge all their transactions, and that's a big business. And this currency trading really is a complete refutation of Milton Friedman's key thesis that he managed to persuade Richard Nixon was valid, that floating currencies would, first of all, destroy the value, would eliminate the value of gold, would greatly reduce the amount of reserves that central banks around the world would have to maintain, and would eliminate all the hedging that goes on. But instead, the floating currencies have resulted in a kind of chaos of currencies that now manifests itself in trade wars and other conflicts around the and it's actually resulted in a kind of decline of world trade. So Joe Gelderman gave it a crucial call for the elimination of floating currencies as the appropriate response to the economic crisis of 2008 that then had just occurred. At the same time, an anonymous man named Satoshi Nakamoto, is pseudonymous, made a similar insight responding to the breakdown of world trade and finance in 2008. And Satoshi advised also a new currency system that would replace the current floating of currencies around the world with its all its inefficiencies and results in a kind of hyper-financialization, a hypertrophy of finance. So, and he proposed Bitcoin and a new cryptocurrency. And I believe that those two speeches are really a critical development because Satoshi's white paper, Joe Gelderman's speech to the IMF together addressed the crucial disarray in the world economy, which Hayek described as the government control or manipulation of money is the root and source of all monetary evil. And so we're now in what I call the era of the cryptocosm, where we're trying to combine a new currency with a new system of the world and a new way to integrate the insights of the advocates of essentially a tie to gold, like Joe Gelderman, and the creators of cryptocurrencies. And I think these two together can transform the world economy in current decades. And the reason I think this change can happen is that systems of the world can change in an information age as fast as minds can change. In 2008, the world's 4 top companies in market cap were Exxon, Walmart, China Petroleum, and then International Chinese Industrial and Commercial Bank. That's 2008. To 2018, today really, the top 4 companies are Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Apple. And this is an amazing triumph of American information technology. But I think it suffers from a grave flaw that will be damaging in the future. So how did this phenomenal change happen? In an information age, economies can change as fast as minds can change. And you can see this kind of change in Shenzhen, which 2007 is the first picture, 2012 is the second one, and 2017 and today is the third. And Shenzhen is really a center of the U.S. economy, though many people hesitate to acknowledge it. It's where much of U.S. high technology technology hardware is actually assembled and produced. And it's also the greatest capitalist triumph in China. When I went to China with Milton Friedman in 1988, what I heard Milton say was the crucial thing for the Chinese government to do was to take control of the money supply. And I was sort of perplexed that Milton should be advocating that some Chinese government, communist government, expand its control of anything. But in any case, I said that a better solution was to let 1 billion flowers bloom. Mao had previously generously urged that China let 100 flowers bloom, and so 1 billion flowers seemed to be a more, although also modest idea. But then at a press conference in Shanghai, at a press conference in Hong Kong, excuse me, I was asked what would happen in 1997, and that was the year that Chinese communists were scheduled to take over Hong Kong, and this was in 1988. And I said, in 1997 is the year that Hong Kong will begin to take over China. And this is indeed what we see in Shenzhen. Shenzhen is just over the water from Hong Kong, and it has really become a great industrial center. Now, all this is the real challenge that the world economy faces, that world capitalism faces, is this new effort by the Chinese to flout Michael Novak's trinity of interconnecting supports, pillars of support for capitalist economics, the cultural and spiritual supports, cultural, political, and spiritual. And China is removing the political side of it. They're trying to establish a different kind of culture that doesn't respect freedom of speech, but allows incredible amounts of freedom of commerce, in some ways substantially greater than in the United States. And this is the great challenge we face today in fulfilling Michael's great visionary the spirit of democratic capitalism. The Chinese think they can extract the democratic side of it and prevail, and so far they are succeeding. They have between 3 and 4 times as many initial public offerings on the stock market as we do. We kind of extinguish most of our IPOs, as they're called. That's the way that small companies gain access to public markets and public investment and reward their investors. And IPOs have pretty much collapsed, technology IPOs in the United States. While in China, they now have 3 or 4 times as many, and it's increasing all the time. And this is kind of an alarming signal of a new kind of challenge. They also now have just passed more venture capital than we do. And today, many Chinese entrepreneurs from the United States are returning to China. Kai-Fu Lee, who wrote a great book about AI and who was head of Microsoft in China and then head of Google in China, and built up both these companies with great success, has now returned to China and is trying to foster entrepreneurship and venture capital in China. And he has had tremendous successes so far, and his book is quite fascinating. Kai-Fu Lee, AI, the AI Challenge. But he essentially believes in this Google philosophy that somehow AI is a final kind of attainment of human economics. I call it Google Marxism, because Google is repeating exactly the same error that Karl Marx made in contemplating the Industrial Revolution. All steam engines and looms and new equipment that made possible the Industrial Revolution, Marx believed to be a kind of eschaton, a final thing, a final human attainment. And in the future, the only challenge would no longer be producing wealth, it would merely be redistributing wealth. That was Marx's response to the Industrial Revolution, and I think his critical error was to imagine that humans could somehow resign themselves to a static equilibrium of redistributing wealth. And this is the same error that Google makes. Google says that its search engines, its artificial intelligence, its machine learning, its all its new technologies represent a kind of eschaton. They not only replace human labor, as Marx believed, they also replace human minds. And that is Google Marxism. And I think the Chinese, the real question is whether the Chinese devotion to really an increasingly deterministic political regime can accommodate human beings, the essence of human beings, as Michael Novak said, creative in the image of their creator, in a mind-centered system where human minds don't all consolidate in a few giant data centers or agglomerate in a few places, or even get subsumed by the minds of Brennan Page and Elon Musk or whoever. Human minds are distributed all around the world. And what determines the success of any economy is how well the creativity of human minds is accommodated. And I think that Michael Novak's insight will eventually be vindicated in China and everywhere else. But we have a path, a very challenging path to ply until that time comes. And that's really the great challenge we faced at this Novak Symposium.